So we will have a chance to both confront the challenges in science and management of cumulative impact, but also think about solutions. And that's something we really needed. So the keynote today, the title of the talk by Martin, it's biodiversity conservation from monitoring to decision making. Martin is a professor at the TU Aqua in Copenhagen. We are very happy to have him here today. He's coordinating the Horizon Europe project, Be Useful, dealing with cumulative impact on marine biodiversity and managing sustainably the cumulative risk. So we are happy to invite Martin to introduce us to the topic.
Thank you very much. Just see if I can handle this one. Sure, probably. So thanks a lot, Raoul, and thanks a lot for inviting me to attend this exciting and very relevant and timely conference. And I've been thoroughly enjoying the talks. It's been presenting various examples of responses and consequences of climate change on Arctic ecosystems. And as part of this talk, I'd like to broaden the perspective a little bit and really ask ourselves, in what way can we better understand and to some degree also anticipate the consequent marine ecosystems, and how can we better understand it's needed to inform managers and decision makers for sustainably managing both biodiversity and the resulting ecosystems and functions and services that these support. And in doing so, I'd like to draw on some background and some insights from the EU project that Raoul mentioned called Be Useful, which is in its final year. And it includes colleagues from around Europe and luckily also colleagues from University of Tromsø. It's been a great collaboration, and I'm looking forward to more of that sort. So without further ado, I'd like you to take 2 deep breaths and join me below the surface. And you may ask, like, yes, why 2? Why not just 1? Because every other breath of oxygen that we take is actually at the courtesy of marine plankton. So bear that in mind next time you are scuba diving or snorkeling. And what we will find when we descend below the surface is a truly stunning diversity of variation of different life forms, not only in the lush and warm tropical waters, but also in these latitudes shown by these species. And I'm sure you share this profound and maybe childish fascination for this beautiful diversity, which in itself is worth protecting just because it's there and it's been evolving through millions and so I'm hopeful that you share this fascination and the value that it has. And indeed, my kids do really value this and share that fascination. I'm really happy to share that with my family. The unfortunate thing is that this biodiversity is indeed under pressure from multiple human activities. And we've been talking a lot about climate change, which is, of course, one of the major, and if not the most pressing factor that will influence the biodiversity in the years to come. But as you can see, there are other pressures on marine systems, notably fishing, there's habitat destruction and pollution, and many others, of course. So the results of these pressures and potentially the cumulative impacts of those is that we are losing diversity, not only in the sea, but also on land, or at least we are facing an elevated risk of losing diversity. The unfortunate thing is that we're not doing very well in tackling this biodiversity loss. As you can here vividly see from the IPBES report published in 2019 that went through how well we are moving towards achieving the key targets that were set up to be achieved by 2020. And as you can see in this column, it's alarmingly red, meaning that we're not doing very well to combat this, to rectify this situation. So there's clearly need for more action and to some degree also better. But then some people may say, well, so what? And the same ignorant person might also say, what's in it for me? I'm sure you're equally tired of seeing this man in media, so I will soon make him go away again. But the key thing is, how can we actually convey that this is indeed very important, not only for us, but for mankind in general. And in doing so, we need to realize and also communicate that humans and biodiversities are intimately dependent, or actually, well, biodiversity is not dependent on us, but we are dependent on healthy ecosystems because they do provide us with a lot of functions and services that are vital for our well-being. And that could be a broad range of services, such as climate regulation, it's food provisioning, and of course recreation, as you saw my kid enjoying snorkeling and diving for this first time. So clearly, this is not just a nice to do kind of thing. It is something that is essentially important for us to bear in mind, that we are ourselves dependent on healthy oceans. But the major challenge is then, okay, how can we then safeguard biodiversity and maintain these healthy and productive ecosystems? How can we then help our managers and decision makers to minimize potential impacts and risks that are arising from these multiple uses of the ocean space? And as part, throughout the next couple of minutes, I will be dwelling on some key ingredients that I see needed to tackle these questions. First of all, we need to improve and continue to be monitoring what is out there, essentially. What is the species and organisms out in our waters and on our bottoms and in our plankton. But we also need to be mapping and monitoring our own human activities to get an idea of the exposure to these kind of pressures. Secondly, we need to have a better process understanding of what are the underlying responses or sensitivities of species or communities or habitats to these set of pressures, if you wish. And finally, we need to take this improved understanding, improved mapping of that, and feed it into a scientifically informed management and decision making, where we can make use of tools and decision support tools formulated on the best available science to provide this scientific advice. And of course, in a nutshell, it is really about us tackling the exposure. We cannot really manage the sensitivity of creatures unless there's some way in which can help them to adapt, but that's unlikely to happen. So what we need to do is to be thinking about how can we limit exposure, given that we know how sensitive different species or habitats are, because that's the only way in which we can limit potential risks. So first of all, what we typically do when we monitor, we use different type of nets. We can use bottom trawls, we can use plankton nets, or we can use bottom grabs to tell us something about who's there, in what numbers, and what is the status of biodiversity. But we are increasingly using other type of tools and methods for surveying and monitoring the underwater world, including then optical camera systems, and we're using acoustics that can allow us to be tracking other aspects of animal behavior and dynamics. We're also more recently using eDNA, which I think is another very fruitful tool and approach to be monitoring biodiversity in particular. So what it's clear to me and to many is that we should not just be using one of these, we should be integrating these into a sort of a broader ocean observation platform where we can really leverage and use all these different pieces of information when we monitor biodiversity and life underwater. But we can also use some of these tools and other, of course, to be monitoring our own activities. And I'm sure you have seen this iconic picture from Halpern paper in 2008, which presents a global cumulative impact map. I must say that I disagree with the use of impact in that, because it doesn't really monitor impact. It does monitor exposure to certain hazards. It does not have an implicit response of the organisms living there. But then again, it does indeed serve to stack up a set of human pressures and map to what extent these overlap in different areas in the world. So you can clearly see that in our waters, there's a high impact, if you wish, or a high exposure, I would like to say, of human activities. If we now look into a more updated version of this, published now last year actually, you can see that in the near future and up until 2050, this impacts or exposure to hazards are expected to increase in some parts of the world, especially on our latitudes up here. So which means that a lot of these different hazards or pressures are expecting to lead to have increased activities in the Arctic. And I'm sure you're all aware of this could be increased shipping lanes, it could be increased use of offshore resources, offshore mining, and so on and so forth. So we are indeed facing these new challenges in the years ahead. So these, of course, these just show us what might be the exposure be, what are the actual impacts and responses and also the associated risks of these. Then we need biology of critters. And one way to try to infer the potential responses of species to different impacts is through some sort of expert judgment-based scoring system. And in this particular exercise done through the Be Useful project, we've been looking into a way in which we can score the species sensitivities here to two of the main human pressures you can imagine, or that we see as most urgent in our waters, is the sensitivity to climate change and the sensitivity to fishing. So what we've been doing is a trait-based scoring system where the species are scored according to some key features and adaptations that they have that may be either favorable or unfavorable with respect to climate change or fishing. So as an example here, we could highlight two different species that may be either quite not very sensitive as the bogue sea bream, or species that are more sensitive to climate change. Conversely, we could also look at species that are typically considered, according to their traits, being less vulnerable or sensitive to fishing. For instance, European anchovy, which is a fast-growing species, matures really early and produces a lot of offspring. Compared to a ray that matures very late, it's very susceptible to fishing and produces very few offspring. So clearly, a life history strategy or a set of traits that makes it very sensitive to fishing. So this is a sort of a trait-based scoring system that can be based on expert judgment, sometimes very well supported by knowledge, sometimes perhaps less. And we can, of course, combine this into an overall landscape, which plot all the species and the different scores. And it's obvious that some species are in harm's way for both of these pressures, such those in the upper right quadrant. Some are the more less sensitive, of course, indicate some priority in terms of what species should we be considering in management. So it serves that purpose in its own right, this exercise. But of course, there are other ways in which we could try to understand or increase our knowledge in terms of responses of species. So beyond this trait-based or expert judgment systems, we could use data-driven method, statistical tools more specifically. And I'm sure you're aware of these species distribution models where we can sort of use our observations of presence and absence of species. Of course, these are not marine critters in the Alps. This is a terrestrial example, I would say, where we combine our observations, and of course, this could also be an abundance of biomass and so on. We combine that with a set of environmental predictor or pressures that we deem are important to try to explain the variation where we don't find them and where we find them. And then what comes out is a set of response curves that to many degree can reflect the relationship between a set of drivers and the response variable. In this case, the abundance or presence absence of the species. And then once fitted, we can use these to generate predictions of these species in time and space. Of course, it's kind of a modeling tool then assumes all species to be in isolation of each other. And we know that that's fundamentally wrong. So luckily, there are new recent developments called joint species distribution model, where we actually consider that species co-occur in communities. So here we have multiple species that co-occur either in space or in time or both. And we can model them jointly as a function of the set of environments, but we can also build in these attributes or traits to help us get a bit of a more of a mechanistic understanding of the actual responses of organisms. And what comes out again is the same thing. We get some predictions that we can generate maps, and you'll be seeing some of these later on in the talk. The key thing we're talking about sensitivities is that we do get these kind of responses that we can, these actually estimated coefficients from these models, but they can be visualized as being either positive or negative responses to a set of drivers. So here we have a set of species, and here we have a set of drivers. And you can see that species that are with a blue color are essentially experiencing a negative relationship to the specific driver, and red being a positive. So once again, you see the same message. There are some species responding, but these do not really allow us to say something about, well, what about species interactions? What about predator-prey interactions on these? We cannot really resolve that right now, but we know that is very important. So in that case, to use other tools and means possible, and to ask ourselves, well, how can we assess this sort of upper food web and ecosystem consequences of impacts? So then we need another set of tools, and of course you're familiar with this kind of very complex food web models with each node being connected by links to its predators and prey. Of course, if we do have these set of methods, and I know in the Barents Sea there are plenty of these, we should definitely use these. But there's also other ways in which we can try to embrace or to simplify this complexity. And what we are using within the Be Useful is a more of a trait-based model that resolves interactions between species conditioned on their size and also their vertical position in the water column. So ranging from sort of epipelagic predators in the top part down to species that are in the sort of the twilight zone, the mesopelagic, or the species that are more associated to the bottom. And then once set up, once again based on first principles, and I should mention that also all vital rates in this model is considering temperature and other environmental variables. So that's where we can bring in a sort of more mechanistic response to climate change more particularly. And what comes out of this sort of exercise is some predictions of food web structure and ecosystem functions. So it could be the way in which the network is wired, if you wish, and also some outcomes in terms of this might be the potential fisheries production, for instance, of these different guilds in space and in time. So it's clear that to cover the complexity of species distributions and community composition, but also food web and ecosystem, we cannot just rely on one piece of information. We need multiple tools and multiple models to advise decision making. And one piece of decision making and advice that is very relevant at the moment, and which is indeed at the forefront of the project that we are running, is to tackle the challenge we're facing in terms of achieving the 30 by 30 target. So for those of you who may not know of it, it's setting aside 30% of both our on land and in water, setting that aside for protection. And it's quite clear that, well, and also the focus there is on areas of high biodiversity value, whatever that is. So that's something we need to define as well. And it's clear that this is not something you can just do in isolation, because we do need to bear in mind that, once again, there's a lot of different actors and ocean uses that we need to bear in mind. And of course, we need to bear in mind that there are conflicts and trade-offs between these. So the trick is, how can we make use of our improved knowledge to fit for uptake in marine spatial planning? Thank you. So the Be Useful project is really about developing a decision support tool that can allow end users, or managers in this case, to visualize maps of distribution or of overall biodiversity indicators for fish and benthos, and it can compare that against maps of human pressures. In that way, we can sort of prioritize and assess trade-offs. And the workflow is really to leverage on our monitoring infrastructure, We can feed this into the modeling tools that you just saw. These tools can provide maps and time series of key indicators of biodiversity status and trends. These can feed into this decision support tool. And last but not least, this needs to be co-created with managers in such a way that it is actually truly useful. So just one briefly example of what these kind of tools can generate. So here is some output from one of these species distribution models for the Northeast Atlantic. And here what underlies this map is individual species level predictions that are then aggregated up to a set of indicators, biodiversity indicators being richness and evenness or taxonomic and functional, and then merged together or summed together into an overall joint index, then reflecting areas of overall high or sort of low diversity, if you wish. We can then compare that map with a map of mean fishing effort, just as an example of a key pressure affecting marine biodiversity, which we can also manage. And the question is, okay, how can we set aside 30% protection in these hotspots by minimizing trade-off with fishing? So if we just play out this potential prioritization game, we can come up with a potential prioritization. Of course, this is just one potential outcome, and it's still a work in progress and needs to be refined. But if we were to implement this actual protection, well, what are the potential trade-offs? Well, if we just do that, we can then compare, like, what is the fishing opportunities excluded? And you can see that setting aside 30% protection does not lead to a very dramatic reduction in overall fishing effort. It's a 9% relative to the mean in that previous period. Of course, in some areas, such as the North Sea, it's a quite strong reduction needed. But mind you, this reduction is without effort reallocation of the fishery. So it's clear that we can indeed potentially close off or set aside areas for protection without a dramatic cost in overall fishing effort. And mind you, there will also be positive spillover effects of improved status and so on. So I would say there are synergies and win-win strategies to exploit. But of course, we do need to bear in mind that there are other trade-offs and sectors that we need to account for in management. So to sum up, how can we better safeguard biodiversity and really minimize these potential cumulative impacts? We need improved monitoring, we need better process understanding, and we need to combine this into effective decision-making that makes use of this knowledge in a way such as tailor the needs for those specific policies. And with that, I'd like to thank some funders, collaborators, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Martin. Really interesting. For the sake of time, I allow for one question before we move on.
Very interesting presentation. My name is Håkon Hopp. I'm from the Norwegian Polo Institute. You seem to link biodiversity to habitat quality to some extent. So, you know, higher biodiversity, the better the habitat. In the Arctic, the biodiversity is increasing because of climate change. Mm. So how do you then relate biodiversity measure as some kind of biodiversity value, habitat value, when the biodiversity, both on land and in the ocean around here, is increasing?
But that's really true, and that is something that's quite important to bear in mind. Like, what are we managing towards? Because we can have a set of indicators that will likely potentially more boreal species coming into our waters here. Then by default, you'll have an increase in the number of species. So then it's, of course, a question is, do we then favor the presence of some more resident, more Arctic species? Then, of course, we need to favor that in our assessment, and we need to account for that. So compositional changes is very important. We cannot just use bluntly one metric of success, using species richness as the key metric of biodiversity. There's a whole array of different complementary indicators that we need to collectively use that would give us a better perspective on to what extent is biodiversity changing and what are the different facets of change, and how does that manifest itself in changes in structure functions. So clearly you open up an interesting question there. Yeah, thanks.
Good answer and good question. Thank you both for that. Martin will be around, so he's also open, I think, for many more questions in the coffee breaks.
Definitely. So,
thanks, Martin.
thank you.
Thank you, Martin. We have seen with Martin what challenges are ahead of us with regard to providing information and advice based on the field data. There are other challenges when dealing with cumulative impact. One main challenge is that we know there are interactions between stressors that are very difficult to address with field studies. Our next speaker has addressed that specific problem through experiments. So Quang Dinh, who is at University of Oslo, is an experimental biologist addressing interactions between stressors in his experiments, and will present how multiple stressors induce overwintering disruption in Arctic zooplankton. So, next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's always difficult to talk after the plenary talks. And the thing that I will bring something from the laboratory experiment, and it's not always communicated well with the modelings and field observation. That's another story. So laboratory experiments normally tell another stories, and in a way that we try to understand what's going on in the systems. So I have been working a lot on the experimental biology, focusing on how multiple stressors interacts and what does this mean for the cumulative impacts, really impacts here, and I don't know much more about something else. Yes, so just like I have been putting a lot of things to my presentation, and then I move it out, and at the end I decide, okay, just this one, just so something is going on in the Arctic with warming, with blooming, seasonality, ocean acidification. That's the key stressors that we have been working on. And by the interaction of the stressors, I have tried to identify how stressor might have the additive effects or antagonistic or synergistic, and what mechanisms does stressor can interact differently in different contexts. Let's say, like, if you see from here, this warming can have the direct effect on the organisms, and the effect can have the different impacts on different trophic levels, so they have different sensitivities. And warming can also increase the toxicity of many organic pollutants. So warming and organic pollutant together, it can really magnify the effect of each other. But in another way, warming can also accelerate the degradation of the organic pollutants in the way that it can reduce the real exposure concentration in nature. And how it works and what kind of interaction we see, it's really depending on which factor will be more dominant in the interactions. And then recently I have been focusing a lot on the winter stress ecologies. On winter here, not only the seasons, one season of the years, but winter actually is the forgotten seasons. If you look at the freshwater, the marine, the terrestrials, winter is really the time that no one really do the experiments. It's because of the inconvenience. We don't want to go out during Christmas times and instead of staying inside, right? And that has been the case. And so the winter important or not, actually, I've seen that winter actually the key filter for how the organisms can like sustain the populations. If they have to move from the southern, from the like Atlantic water to the Arctic, whether they can sustain population in the Arctic or not, really depending on the winter condition, is it harsh enough or not. The same for the birds. If the winter is not so cold, they may stay in Norway, or they may stay in Europe. They don't move to Africa. Or if it's very cold, then the winter condition can really change the biodiversity from local to global scales. And follow with it is relating to all the interactions and the eco-evolutionary dynamics. And I've been focusing a lot on the Arctic polar ice, where a lot of biological activity going on in the winters. But normally we see nothing in the dark and cold, everything below the sea ice. We assume there's nothing else important there. It's better to spend time with the family for Christmas. That's the things. And then I just provide two of the examples that we have been doing in the past few years. The first one that we try to test a very simple experiment with Kalanut glacialis, one of the 3 Kalanut species in the Arctic. Very simple experiments with 2 temperatures and 2 different pH levels. Let's try to simulate the oceanification scenarios. We do a lot of analysis, but I will not show them all. So as you can see from the survival that even with oceanification, it has better survival compared to the control. But with the oceanification and warming together, it doubled the mortalities. And this is one of the things. And when we check for when the copepod moves from the finals copepodized stages to the adults and ready for reproductions. And you can see that with 4-degree warmings, everything happens just in 1 week. And I told you that this is exactly the week of Christmas we spent in the lab. And it's just in 1 week, you can see like 90% of them just move into adults with 4 degrees of warmings. So remember, timing here is about 4 months before the spring bloom, where they can be really ready for reproductions. And for the lipid consumption at the energy reservoirs, and this is what we observe from the experiments, and I asked my student if can you model when they consume all the lipid in warming. And actually, we saw that with warmings, they depleted the lipid content in March, early March. It's about at least a month before the spring bloom. And with the normal conditions, they go on the way, really, they have enough energy for the spring bloom. And this mismatch really showed us with the warming climate, it can have the really big problems. At kind of what we try to formulate at the filters for the wide population to sustain in a certain conditions. And actually, it's why we try to find the hypothesis that matched to our data. We didn't find anything, and then each time we come up with something for our own. And when I try to search more, and I see that this is also true for also freshwater and terrestrial ecosystems. So winter condition is changing fast, and a few degree warming in the summer might not be really a big problem, but a few degrees changing or a few conditions changing in the winter time might really filter a lot of species out in certain areas. And then with that, we go further with the second example that we try to identify where the system can cross a certain tipping point. We have been talking about tipping points since the morning to now, and then we try to do it with the experiments that we conduct with 15 different pH to really see the nonlinear response, and with or without different temp warming scenarios. Because we hypothesize that in the warming condition, we expect that the tipping point to oceanification will happen earlier. And this is what we did with Metridia longas in one of the cruise with Paul. And then we found that this is the tipping point of the Metridia for pH. When the pH levels go below 7.05, the survival decreases quickly after that, and it's really changing at a certain point. And then with different temperatures, it actually happening earlier, as you can see here. And remember that the pH is a log scale of the hydrogen concentration in the waters. So we have a few more recently published papers relating to the same topic, not limited only to the Arctic, but I do recommend you to check it. So at the end, we are still really working on the new hypothesis that we have now to see really how winter can filter out which species and which species can sustain in the Arctic. And with this, I would like to thank many of the papers in the rooms and also many not here for a lot of contribution in the lab, especially during the winter times. And some have to spend Christmas with us. Thank you.
Christmas time is important, you know.
I know.
We have time for a few questions from the room, if there's any. I will walk around.
Hi, thanks for the really interesting talk. I had a question about the lipid metabolism. What was the temperature differences, and what state were the copiopods in when you were measuring it? Were they in diapause or were they active?
Well, here it is. You can see the timing here. So it is really during the middle of the polar nights. We assume that they are in the diapause, but I'm not 100% sure they are really in the deep. I'm not 100% sure they are in the deep diapause. And at low temperatures, you see they have the lower like consumption of the lipid contents, and we know that it's about 25% of the respiration if they are in the diapause compared to the normal respirations.
Sorry, just a follow-on question then. Was this based on incubation experiments where they were in bottles and you were measuring lipid depletion over time in the same individuals?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. You will also be hanging around, I think, a bit. So any more questions you might have? We're going to ask to go for the coffee break afterwards. Then we have to move on to the next speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So as we promised, the interaction, studying the interactions through experiments is really rewarding. And we've seen how you can address those interactions, how you can help synthesize sensitivities to multiple stressors through experiment. But one challenge with experiments is the upscaling. So when we want to see what will happen in the field, we either do, as Martin has shown us, use field data, or you need to infer either from models, or you need to account for some of the factors that affect species in the ecosystem. Ecological interactions are such factors that need to be accounted for. And our next speaker, Mikhail, and it's Zemchun-Snikov, so Misha, he will talk about standardizing, so towards standardization of species interactions data for Arctic network comparison. And he focuses on, again, Arctic ecology in Svalbard area, and particularly the shorebird-arthropod interactions. So please.
God ettermiddag, damer en meneer. Det er hyggelig å være her på Arctic Frontiers, and that's pretty much it. How I can use my Norwegian at the moment. Thanks for introducing the topic so I can spend more time on my Norwegian. This is a group of wonderful scientists, and probably you know some of them. Probably you don't know me too well, but look at these hats. This is truly a representation of the spirit of the scientists. But more importantly, these heads somehow are connected. Thanks. These heads somehow are connected. So they all are interlinked. But also, how do they interlinked in a different way. Some of them are linked tighter than others, but also how you measure it. Because, for instance, I have joint publications with Thomas Roslin. I'm currently employed by Anna Travised. Anna Travised is collaborating with Thomas Roslin and partly with Steve Coulson. So how do we merge it all together, all these different metrics, to come up with some inference about this small network of heads? I will skip this part because I think it's not really a big surprise that there are big changes going on in Arctic, and especially in Svalbard, which is terrestrial hotspot. And, the most of the talks, maybe 90% of the talks, are about marine ecosystem, and I will be talking about terrestrial part. And of course, these changes are reshaping the biodiversity. Ranges are shifting, phenologies are shifting, physiologies of species are shifting. And we also observe new types of interactions. That's, of course, a question when scavenging on white-beaked dolphins because of the range shifts of the dolphins. they are not only scavenging on reindeers, but also were documented to actively chase reindeers in the field. So basically they're hunting now, they're predating them. Also, there were different species for which new types of interaction observed, like Atlantic walruses hunting geese. Yeah, and the interaction between walruses and different birds, they were observed in different parts of Arctic. Yeah, like more in the Alaskan area, but for Svalbard, it's really something new. And let's go back to the past and see what were the idea about ecological network in Arctic in the past, like almost a century ago. And I want to take you back to this old overview, which was called a nitrogen cycle by Summerhays and Elton. And though it may seem complicated, what they inferred that there are no elaborate chains. It's pretty straightforward. And then 80 years later, Hodgkinson and Coulson updated this thing, and they made emphasis on quite complicated and elaborated network of invertebrates, while vertebrate food web was relatively simple still. So, and here we go. These previous networks, these previous schematics, blueprints of Arctic, mainly terrestrial network, they didn't incorporate interaction strength component into it. And we just try to go back to the past, reinspect the existing literature where the interaction strength data is available, and so then we can kind of rebuild the previous schematics. So we did a literature survey in Scopus, and in total 704 papers on vertebrates and 239 on invertebrates were found. 71 of them originated from initial scrolling, and some extra we added as cross-references, and the majority of them were on vertebrates and some on invertebrates. By some I mean one. And of course it doesn't mean that invertebrate community is not studied in terms of interaction. It means that the most of the papers were not considered like useful for our approach. It didn't pass the criteria. So, and there is a huge bias, especially bias towards studying the interactions of flagship species. Arctic foxes, polar bears, reindeers, these are beautiful creatures indeed, but when we focus on them, then we also bias our idea about how ecological network is structured. And there is, of course, methodological bias. Sometimes it's fecal content, sometimes it's stomach content, esophagus content, whatever you can imagine. Different metrics are used: frequency of occurrence, caloric equivalent, relative quantity, and of course there is a huge dispersal of studies in space and time. So, what to do with all this data? We just try to standardize it, and for this we classified all the interactions into 4 general types. The first type is keystone interactions. For instance, interaction between polar bear and ring seal, or true seals feeding mainly on fish. Next type of interactions are primary interactions. That means that to successfully reproduce and survive, for instance, predators should rely on 2-3 types of resources. For instance, Arctic fox in Svalbard in rodent-free tundra is scavenging on reindeer carcasses and also actively hunting mainly juveniles of seabirds. There are also auxiliary interactions, regularly occurring over space and time, but not impactful enough for the fitness of the consumer, so we can classify it either as primary or keystone. And marginal interactions. For instance, polar bears scavenging on reindeers, though this idea is re-evaluating. Maybe you heard about the recent paper that polar bears are really doing well, and mainly because they are scavenging more actively on reindeers. or walruses hunting geese. So, to deliver the message in a better way, we should simplify schematics a bit. So, and just a few examples. Polar bears mainly relying on true seals, but also they can forage on other sea and also terrestrial nodes. The same applies for Arctic fox, but their primary foods, but they can also scavenge and predate on a variety of taxa. And the same we can do for different groups. And the idea is that after you build up, of course we can also do it for subwebs. Sorry, I'm running out of time. So, and the idea is that when you can operate interaction strength, you can easily visualize energy flow, highways, and kind of country roads. And then that can be like a good tool to deliver like a next level conceptualization to non-specialists. We can compare winter and summer diets using this method, and it doesn't fall to 1, 2, 4, or 8 because we also averaged data when it was collected when there were several studies on the same species. So, and we can repeat the same for different Arctic sites. We can repeat the same for different parts of Svalbard. So, and of course there are remaining problems, and I already told about them when I was talking about biases. And there were remedies, and I think the main remedy is just combining efforts. I mean, there is nothing new. Joining efforts, creating big consortiums, like tighter cross circumpolar collaboration between scientists. So big initiatives, maybe Nordic circumpolar database can be this initiative. So it's like Globy, but better. So with some nice visual interface, it's not something created, it's just my sketch, but it can be realized, right? And we already saw these type of things from other talks from Marine Network. So, and then, for instance, you can select an area and it will create something like that, and this is based on the actual data. So, wouldn't that be great? I guess it would, and especially for educators, for policymakers, just to have this thing which you can easily explore, which is engaging, at the same time, which deliver not really simple messages, things are connected. Of course, things are connected, everything is intertwined, but how? What are the main flows? So, funding is going down, but there are perspectives, and of course these perspectives are in data collaborations. And I just want to finish the talk with the quote of this great scientist, Emmett Brown. So the future is whatever you make it, so make it a good one. Reconsider things, restructure things. Have this standardized way, we can overcome these biases. So we can try to do something like bigger, nicer, also nicer outside of the academia. Thank you very much.
That's a very nice talk. Thank you so much. If there is any questions, we have a bit of time. And I ignored you last time, so you can go first.
Your presentation. My name is Saara Lilja. I'm from Finland. I'm from Emergency Company. And we are building wildfire preparedness network. I am biologist and plant ecologist, but in a way, I would like to see in marine ecosystem analysis also, I would like to see wildfire threat. And I don't know what is my question for you, but perhaps you understand that because we are building more sustainable nature, and the problem is that we still have a lot of people who can't understand that the planetary well-being, it's like a connection around, so yeah. would you like to answer something for me? Yeah, thank you. And welcome to network. If you want to connect to Wildfire Network, please contact me.
Thanks a lot. That's a very nice message and a very difficult question to answer. But for sure, we can expand. We can expand this network. We can also. I just didn't include. For instance, I could include more like about the marine part. I'm just not a specialist. That's why I'm saying I can't. I don't have a big enough brain to understand everything. So, and if there are good options for collaborations, I would be happy to do it. That would be my dream as a scientist to have like a well-delivered message to a wider audience. So, because also my basic background is teacher. I actually like to simplify concepts. I like to make them accessible. And what Martin also did a good job from my talk. Thanks a lot. Just with his third bullet point that we need to deliver. We need to deliver accessible message to the audience. So, yeah. And if it's not ecology but something else, sure. I think this type of method can be easily used.
We're running out of time. Thank you so much for your presentation and a good answer.
Okay, I'm going to be daring. I'll try to link back to the question. So wildfires and secondary emissions, they affect the pollution levels in these areas in the north, in the Arctic. The next talk will move from data and empirical studies into modeling, and we look into how those interactions that Misha and others are studying, and the structural interactions and strength, can affect pollution levels in Arctic organisms. So our next speaker, it's Inger Krogset. She's at NILU. She is also affiliated with UiT, the Arctic University of Norway, and works with modeling, investigating climate change impacts on contaminant exposure in the Arctic using the nested exposure model. Is her talk. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Raoul, for a very nice introduction. I will try to talk into the mic. Unfortunately, no funny hats, no Christmas, no Santa Claus, but I have a cute polar bear at least. Okay, let's see. Okay, so in addition to climate change and loss of biodiversity, pollution is the third triple planetary crisis that we are currently facing. I will talk today about some type of contaminants called persistent organic pollutants. These are chemicals which are persistent in the environment. They bioaccumulate in organisms and food webs, causing toxic effects. And in addition, they can be long-range transported across long distances. As a result, top predators in the Arctic often have quite high concentrations of these chemicals emitted at much more southerly latitudes. Right now, climate change is impacting lots of different processes, both in the physical environment and in the food webs, as we have heard a lot about today. We know that this also impacts how the contaminants move in the environment and the food webs, but we don't really yet understand the mechanisms and the dynamics and how this affects the contaminant dynamics in total when it all happens at the same time. So what we want to do with this modeling study is to evaluate how the impact of both global emissions of POPs and climate change impact contaminant dynamics in the Arctic. So both emissions, transport to the Arctic, and interactions within the Arctic itself. We are looking particularly on polar bears in this specific case study. So what we have done is to develop a model called the Nested Exposure Model, NEM. This is a model that simulates the whole link between global emissions of industrial chemicals and exposure to Arctic ecosystems. NEM is a global model. It integrates the physical environment and food webs in an integrated model. It is temporally and spatially resolved. It uses global chemical emissions, physico-chemical properties of chemicals, and large amounts of geophysical, biological, ecological information feeding into the model to simulate how the chemical moves both in the physical environment and also in the food webs. Hence, it's a quite cross-disciplinary tool to collect all the information we have to see how it interacts. Recently, we have adapted the model to also be able to account for a change in climate. Structurally, the model is built in a nested fashion with a user-defined spatial resolution on a global scale, and each grid cell consists of up to 10 to 15 different compartments, so it covers both air, ocean, water, soil, sediments, as well as the food web within each grid cell. The results I will show you today are based on global emissions of a chemical called PCB 153. This is an industrial chemical which has been used heavily since the 1930s already in all kinds of different products. It was regulated first in the 1970s on a global scale. And here you can see the global emission curve of PCB 153, clearly showing how international regulation decreases emissions on a global scale. We ran our model with global emissions estimate, assuming a constant climate representative of 2015 as our default simulation. And then we also ran climate scenarios using the same global emissions of PCB 153, but also using IPCC climate scenarios for the CMIP6 model runs for the SSP 8.5 scenario from 2015 until 2100. Here we have accounted for changing air temperatures, sea surface temperatures, wind speed, and sea ice extent to see how this impacts contaminant dynamics. So this is just an example to show you what kind of results the model can produce. This here is a model evaluation. On the x-axis here, you can see measured concentrations of PCB 153 in Arctic food webs on Svalbard, while the y-axis shows model estimated concentrations of PCB in the same species. As you can see, the model succeeds quite well in reproducing bioaccumulation of PCB in the whole food web, spanning from lichen and zooplankton to fish species, seabirds, marine mammals, including polar bears. This figure here shows the time trend of predicted PCB 153 in Svalbard female polar bears from 1930 until 2025. The black line and the gray area is the median and the range of the model predictions, including variation with age and season for the polar bears. Again, you can see the peak concentrations here were predicted around the 1980s, corresponding to the global trends in use and emission of these chemicals. The pink dots here are measurements from the Norwegian Polar Institute's database, showing measured concentrations of PCB in polar bears. So you can see the model also enables to reproduce time trends of contaminant concentrations in Svalbard female polar bears. This tells us that the model succeeds in reproducing this link between the emissions happening on a global scale and the local exposure we see on Svalbard, for example. So now on to the future predictions. This here again are the global emission estimates of PCB. Here you can see predicted concentrations of PCB in the Svalbard atmosphere from 1930 to 2100. Again, it follows the global trends for use and emissions of these chemicals. We see the same trend in seawater and in biota species like polar cod or polar bear. What you can note is that even more than 100 years after these chemicals were restricted, they are still predicted to be present in the environment. And this is because of the high persistency of these chemicals. It takes a long time before the chemicals degrade. So what happens when we introduce climate change? Here, with the red area, you can see the same predictions, but in a changing climate. So basically, when we introduce an increasing temperatures, changing wind speed, and reduce sea ice extent, the models predict that concentrations will increase and counteract the ongoing reduction due to the regulation of these chemicals. These numbers are very preliminary, but you see it ranges from a factor of 60% higher to 115% higher in the atmosphere. This is interesting also because it agrees with a lot of empirical observations in the Arctic during the last years, where we have seen that declining time trends of contaminants in some cases flatten out or even increase in the Arctic. So if we then span out to a pan-Arctic perspective, looking at the circumpolar regions, these are model predictions of the relative change in concentrations in polar bear in 2050 and 2100 in a scenario with a changing climate compared to in a scenario where the climate is constant. These are the same results as you saw in the previous slide, with 60% higher concentrations in polar bears on Svalbard. But you can see that this ratio varies a lot in time and space. So other parts of the circumpolar Arctic actually predicted to be impacted much more, with ratios varying up to 250%. But again, these are preliminary results, and we still need to look into the exact mechanistic details and what lies behind this. So what we're doing now is to look a lot more closely at the model predictions. Why do we see these predictions? Is it the fact that temperatures are increasing in source regions, leading to higher secondary emissions and higher input to the Arctic? Is it a decreasing sea ice cover? These are questions we want to answer now. We will also expand to other contaminants beyond PCB 153, and additionally also look at climate scenarios happening in the organisms and food webs, such as changing diets, etc. But we have seen that NEM has a tool as a potential, as a cross-disciplinary tool to evaluate both direct and indirect impacts of climate change, and it can also be used for other regions, other species, or other research questions. Thank you.
Yeah, please stay a little bit. It would be nice to have maybe a question from the room. Usual suspects.
Yeah, very nice talk. Thank you very much. I was wondering if the supply of PCB, so it's not produced anymore as far as I know, where is it coming from if it is increasing?
One aspect is that there are still emissions ongoing. So even if PCB is not being produced anymore, it's still left in waste piles and standing stock. So there are still emissions ongoing from existing sources. The other thing is that you will have so-called secondary emissions. So PCB is being deposited in soils or sediments or ice, which is being remobilized. Wow.
Thank you so much, Ingjerd. It was a very nice talk. And at the same time, because I've been involved in that same project, this project has just been finished. And I think it has been a very nice project. This has been really fantastic work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have seen how scientific challenges regarding climate impact are being addressed across field, experimental studies, and modeling. And I will go over to the management and challenges that are facing. Will be Dr. Martin Sommerkorn, who is head of conservation for the World Wildlife Fund Arctic program, and he leads the WWF's Arctic work on nature conservation, ecosystem management, governance, and climate change. And his talk on systematic Arctic marine conservation planning, WWF ArcNet initiative, and spatial planning tool. Please, Martin.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very glad that I can be here because we wrote this abstract overnight. And the title is, let's say, questionable to attract an audience. So I'm really grateful for the committee see the value of this talk. Yes, as Raoul said, I wear a couple of hats, but I'm also a scientist by background, and I work a lot. Or I should say that two decades back, I made a decision to more actively work in the science to policy interface, and WWF's Global Arctic Program actually is a great place for doing so, and then I've been doing that since. But maybe to combine these different hats that Raoul was just talking about and lead over to this talk, I'd say I was working as the coordinating lead author for the Polar Regions chapter of IPCC Special Report on Oceans and Cryosphere when I visited the Arctic Circle Assembly, and Senator John Kerry from the US spoke and said the two most important things that we need to do in the Arctic is fight climate change and establish a network of marine protected and conserved areas. And I said to myself, is that I'm really glad the guy didn't pose anything else for my desk. So. But yes, let me talk you through systematic Arctic marine conservation planning and how we get to the management side of things. And then I would like to kind of continue off where Martin left it and make it easy because we have the same first name, so that's pretty easy. WWF works, of course, as I said, at the science policy interface. So we come almost from the other side when we motivate our projects. We don't come from the science while we are science-based and recognize the need to actually base everything on science in order to make a good policy. We say, what are the needs of policy to actually make progress on commitments, obligations, or policy mandates that exist. In this type, the policy mandate that the Arctic Council ministers in 2015 already issued to say that they decide to continue to work to develop a pan-Arctic network of marine protected and conserved areas. 2015. The Arctic Council, and partly also I'm having some roles on the expert group of the Arctic Council, renewed this in May 2025, updated this framework, and I get to why in a second. So a policy mandate exists. There is, since 2022, a very prominent commitment that actually most Arctic countries have made to, and I help you here with the highlights, by 2030 to protect and conserve at least 30% of coastal marine areas through systems of protected and conserved areas, to make it short. That's a policy commitment that countries have made. And we know the Arctic Ocean. It doesn't only include areas within the economic zones, it also includes areas beyond national jurisdiction. And as of 2 weeks ago, we are actually officially empowered to also include the areas beyond national jurisdiction, particularly the Central Arctic Ocean, of course, into our efforts to establish such a network. This, importantly, groundbreaking, I would say, agreement actually sets out in its objectives, puts the obligations on the countries to strengthen cooperation and coordination in the use of area-based management tools, and especially also including MPCAs, and has the foremost and prominent objective here to conserve and sustainably use areas requiring protection through systems of area-based management tools, including networks of marine protected areas. So that is a starting point. Luckily, it wasn't a starting point for us. We started working, anticipating this before, exactly after the policy mandate of the Arctic Council. And then we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions. In this room, of course, what is it that we have to plan for? The Arctic Ocean is increasingly under threat, receives more pressures, including from climate change, industrial development. The Arctic Ocean becomes increasingly dynamic with respect to biodiversity features. So the Arctic Ocean scale is an increasingly important one that we should not forget. However, there are for that, all the championing would lie in that coordination and cooperation. So that's an active space we are contributing to resolve. We believe that formulating a vision and cooperative design to establish a pan-Arctic network of MPCAs is a way forward. And now I'm coming back to the title of my talk, Systematic Conservation Planning provides us with such a vision and provides us also, if done right, with a cooperative design. This cooperative design has to be about continuing to develop the network while conditions change and while new knowledge is brought to the table. So more actors, societal actors, actually come in and bring their knowledge to the table, are empowered to participate, and indigenous peoples are certainly a big group in that regard. It's certainly also about identifying concrete areas that address the conservation needs of biodiversity in the setting that we have in the Arctic, and then establishing effective measures. It's also about the roles that many actors and the instruments, for example, those that I mentioned and many more, individually and collectively can take. So it's about ownership of that Pan-Arctic network. How do we get there? Crucial to this ownership is, in our view, creating an agenda that has the ability and to empower and convene actors through knowledge and cooperative tools. So that's where, Martin, you already left it off. That's where I pick up, and I just want to bring two of these tools to you that the WWF has developed, not alone by itself, but with the help of others, and that was a strategic decision of how to actually develop these tools. So ArcNet is an Arctic Ocean network of priority areas for conservation. You can find more information down there at arcnetocean.org. It's also a very prominent publication in Nature Ocean Sustainability. And I make a little footnote just to encourage us here. That was published 2 years ago. It involves Russian scientists, Ukrainian scientists, and WWF at a time when we were an undesired organization in Russia. So don't give up. Just keep going. We need to keep going. It's the only way forward. But back to this. ArcNet is, Rowan Atkinson in a famous new movie would say, it's so much more than a bag. So it is many things at once. It's that map that you see there. It's a mapped vision of a Pan-Arctic marine protected and conserved area network. And interestingly, the analysis way that we took, systematic conservation planning, and I can talk more about the technical specifications in questions maybe, it actually covers 30% of the seas. Actually an outcome of the analysis, not an input to the analysis. It's an outcome of a systematic conservation planning analysis that had set targets at the level, individual and group levels, of over 800 conservation features that we brought together to support this analysis. It is also a design blueprint of how to not only identify but also establish MPCA networks, not only in the Arctic, because it's a transparent approach that can be replicated with a set of tools. As new knowledge becomes available, more actors are engaging. And then most of all, and that's a big takeaway already precluded from this presentation, please, it's an invitation to engage. And it brings it back to the need for all societal actors actually to contribute what they have to establishing conservation, including area-based conservation networks. At the basis of it, and I already hinted at it, at the basis of it is actually the first ever comprehensive spatial database of marine Arctic biodiversity. We compiled about 800 of these conservation features in a spatially explicit way, and we then had an expert process and a tool, Marxan, around it, that allowed us to actually come up with the result that you have just seen. Strategically, these experts were actually brought in from many of those that hold expert group status at the Arctic Council, and therefore also are part of those national exercises that might actually contribute to that network eventually. But identifying that network is only one of the things that we did, because we went forward and said we also need to convene actors around the processes that are needed to actually identify conservation measures. How shall we actually implement that network? These 30% will not all have a fence around them. That's not how this works. Effective conservation comes from so much more than just putting fences around things, especially in the Arctic, where contribution to conservation actually comes from many actors. So the database was there. We combined this data set of conservation features with area-specific, up-to-date data sets of 33 industrial activities. All the different fishing activities, different shipping activities, coastal infrastructure, pipeline building, etc., etc. So 33 of them. We in WWF hold a very up-to-date database on all these activities. We overlaid these, and then we did a very structured assessment of conservation concern. Conservation concern, a scientific assessment of concern. So that goes to your points on sensitivity, vulnerability. We avoided that. We just made a conservation concern index, basically a three traffic light system index that shows concern for each pairing of each of these 33 activities with each of these 800 conservation features. So it's a massive thing. That thing is available. arcticwwf.org, Geranium, go there, play with it. You can click in all conservation features, different functional groups, different industrial activities, and you can produce maps like this, but also on a much smaller scale. Specific maps that would show you, for example, in this case, significant, that's the highest level of concern that we have, significant conservation concerns in specific areas. So in that regard, it maps details of conservation concerns and risks. I put it to the questions that to make the distinction there, if you are interested. But that's we are trying to convene actors in many places around this tool and see how we can actually use this to implement not only the wet network, but also initiate discussions on marine spatial planning outside those networks. I skipped this. And then I just use this to summarize and say that obviously political mandates, obligations, and commitments are in place. With ArcNet and Geranium, purpose-designed tools for establishing conservation measures inside and outside these priority places exist. These tools are collaborative by design, extensive spatial database, the unique one that I mentioned, of Arctic marine life. And so together, they are an invitation to engage in communities of practice because it needs a targeted approach. We need to basically say, here's something that we agree on, here's something that actually we can motivate policy making for. So let's speak to it. Let's bring it forward. All of your voices are needed in that and many others. And let's join the growing choir of voices for a conserved and sustainable Arctic Ocean. Thank you.
Very well put, very well delivered. We have one short question.
And it will be tricky because it comes from Håkon.
It comes from Håkon.
Thanks. I'm still Håkon Hopp from the Polo Institute. That protection map with all the green marked areas that you had, how do you suggest protecting the entire coast from Lofoten and up to Finnmark?
Yeah.
And what are you actually protecting it against here?
Yeah. Well, in short, this map is produced by, let's say, conservation needs. It takes the principles of identifying biological, it takes the principles of the EPSA process, the ecological, biological significant areas, and identifies the best possible solution for that. Or one possible solution for that. That's obviously a place that is pretty important. It is. Yeah, so there's nothing around it. The same applies for the whole west coast of Greenland. In a pan-Arctic perspective, that's where the music plays. So, but we are saying marine protected and conserved areas. So that's why we did this. And then you can actually start talking about what do you want to protect it for or from. And you can basically say, okay, here are the conservation concerns. There are, as I said, a traffic light system in there. The lowest one is basically, that's fine, as long as you adhere to existing rules and regulations, there is no conservation concern, or minimal. And the second one is, actually that conservation concern would be addressed by improving measures, either through better implementation or through slightly appending the criteria that are used for management. The third one is the one that is actually that is important for area-based conservation, where you say, okay, we really have to exclude and manage for conservation. Not all of that area is, but it needs those kind of managements. Does that answer? Yeah. One thing that I would not add to this is that, as I said several times, this is the Pan-Arctic perspective. Our ask is that each and every country does a similar exercise in their national water. And then there are actually, as some of you who are in marine spatial planning know, there are nested designs. You have actually showed us an example for such a nested scale design. And then we use such nested scale designs actually to heed this perspective also in national systematic planning, conservation planning exercises. That will be our ask to government.
Thank you, Martin. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you very much. We move to our last talk. It's conservation planning. There's a joint talk. There are two presenters, and it's Hauk Sia from University of Hamburg, Germany, and Leah Schulz will join us from Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany. So, thank you.
Hello, we're very happy to be here today. It is the season, so I'm here with a slight cold, but I hope you can understand me nonetheless. Okay. Yes, so Hao and I are here today presenting on systematic, dynamic, and collaborative conservation planning in the rapidly changing Arctic. And we'll Project Squeeze, which is a project funded by the German Federal Ministry of Research, Technology and Space. And to give you a quick project intro, Project Squeeze was formed out of a consortium of German institutions, universities, and NGOs, and works in partnership with the Gwich'in Tribal Council in Canada. So that creates a quite interdisciplinary team working with a very broad methodology spectrum to respond to two research questions. And the overall goal is to support the 30x30 target of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which we've heard mentioned several times here today, by developing an interactive decision support tool for the prioritization of conservation areas. And the project is running another year, so we'll be sharing our current results today.
And because of the widespread climate warming, we have observed widespread greening in the Arctic tundra. And part of the reason is the expansion of forests and shrubs into the original tundra areas. And we refer to this process as tundra squeeze. And estimates from our project colleagues suggest that even under the most ambitious climate mitigation scenario, only about 50% of the original tundra areas will remain under climate change. And this would lead to large-scale declines in tundra biodiversity and ecosystem functions. And that's why we need protected areas to conserve these stable Arctic tundra ecosystems. And before we identifying these conservation priorities, we assess the current conservation status in this region. And we found at present only about 16% of these Arctic tundra areas is protected, and this falls well short of the 30% conservation target we set for 2030. And the protection is also uneven across tundra ecoregions, and more than half of these tundra ecoregions falls short of the 30% target. And when we look at tundra species, the situation is similarly concerning. More than half of these tundra species lack sufficient coverage by protected areas, and the gap is even larger for endemic tundra species. Over 80% of them lack sufficient coverage by the protected areas. So we need more sufficient and representative protection in this region. And in response, our project Squeeze developed a framework to support systematic conservation planning in the terrestrial Arctic tundra. So here we integrate environmental, societal, and economic factors with land use modeling, climate projections, and indigenous knowledge. And we model the future changes in key species distributions, tundra extent, and also the ecological functions. And these ecological projections will then combined with socio-economic data within optimization model. And our optimization model aims to achieve balanced protection across ecoregions and species to identify conservation priorities. And very importantly, we also want to work very closely with indigenous communities and organizations within this project.
I would like to share two methods today with you on how we're bringing community insight into conservation planning. And on the one hand, that is a bidirectional approach to knowledge translation, so that there's simultaneous capacity building, both for the communities that we work with and the researchers on our research team. And for that, we use mediums such as films that capture, combine, and synthesize and allow us to share back the knowledge that is shared with us, but also targeted knowledge exchange meetings between our researchers and researchers from the Gwich'in Tribal Councils on topics such as GIS or cultural heritage data. And we were also honored to go and visit communities on 2 extended field trips last year in summer and winter, where we had conversations with elders and land users and administrators around topics such as conservation planning, climate change, and specifically focused on how indigenous knowledge can inform our tundra analysis and what cultural values should be included in the tool. And because conservation with indigenous communities is central to this project, so relationship building does take a lot of time, and we've been really fortunate to see how close of a collaboration has evolved over the course of this one project. And 3 key aspects that we and the partners at GTC have found to be kind of pillars of success has been, on the one hand, the co-leading of fieldwork, so going and spending time on the land, visiting the communities together. Secondly, having a liaison on each side of each institution, which just gives us the capacity and the time to have bi-weekly check-ins, and also to actually focus on building that relationship and trust. And lastly, focusing very much on community consent. So everything that is produced and put forward and decided happens through community approval and is discussed with GTC first. We've also started having conversations with the Nunavut communities, and we're very much looking forward to expanding conversations with communities across the Arctic tundra. And because it's always better to show the work than just speak about it, I wanted to share some of the photos and impressions from our fieldwork in last summer and introduce some of the elders that we had the chance to speak with, such as Abe Wilson and Rachel Willebrand, who are 2 Tetlet Gwich'in elders. And because of the conversations happening around changes on the land and how to protect it, it was very important to us to also be on the land while having these conversations. So it was always the choice of the knowledge holder to decide where we speak, which led us to berry picking in the tundra, to sharing meals at Rock River Campground in the Yukon, and also visiting youth camps, as well as witnessing some of the changes that are happening, like permafrost slums. And last but not least, we wanted to bring some takeaways from the ongoing project. The first one being that conservation planning in the Arctic directly affects indigenous livelihoods, and protected areas in the Arctic can further the rights of indigenous peoples or limit them. So it's very important that the research reflects the lived relationships and not just the scientific concepts.
And then the Arctic squeezing is likely to affect biodiversity and ecosystem functions. So our systematic conservation planning should account for future shifts in species habitat and tundra distributions to implement climate-smart conservation in the Arctic tundra.
Questions of any land use necessitate a co-creative approach to research. So spending time on the land with Arctic peoples is indispensable during research.
And the ultimate goal of our research is to help to prioritize conservation areas to reach the 30 by 30 target in the Arctic tundra. And thank you so much for your attention. And so if you are interested in our project or see any potential for collaborations, please contact Leah or me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very nice talk. We are slightly over time, but we also started a bit later. So I encourage any questions that you may have to go for the coffee break straight away. Shall I wrap up the session or will you speak? I want to really thank the amazing presentations that we saw today, very inspired speakers as well. This will continue tomorrow with 2 more blocks of presentations. The next one actually continuing this topic on co-creation and how to include indigenous knowledge. And with that, I think we break for coffee and cake and stuff. Thanks, guys.